So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 5th Molly Bloom Zoom reading. For those who may not know me, I'm Aidan Semmens, founder and editor of Molly Bloom magazine. If you haven't seen it, I urge you to seek it out at mollybloom.org.uk. You can also find a link there to Molly Bloom's YouTube channel, which has recordings of all the readings in this series so far, and should in due course also have this one tonight. Tonight's reading features 3 poets whose work has appeared in the magazine. Rachael Clyne, who actually makes her Molly Bloom debut in the latest issue, recently put out online, and 2 poets with 9 appearances between them going back to 2014, Presley and Janet Sutherland. For practical reasons, which I'm sure you'll understand, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to stay muted during the readings, but I hope you'll still feel able to feel properly engaged in what is a live event. Even though we sadly can't all go for a drink or a meal together afterwards. Wonderful though that would be. Let's look forward to those things happening again. So first up, we have Rachael Clyne, whose most recent publication, I think I'm right in saying, is the slim but evocative pamphlet Girl Golem, published in 2019 by Forward Press. A largely autobiographical set of poems which also touch on the nuclear catastrophe of Chernobyl, as well as the distinctively Jewish mythology of the proto-robot golem figure. Before that came Singing at the Bone Tree from Indigo Dreams in 2014, and before that, in 2006, P.S. Avalon produced She Who Walks with Stones and Sings. Rachael, who has worked for many years as a counsellor and therapist and has written a guide to recovering lost self-esteem, describes herself now as a climate activist, something I think we all should be. Rachael.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, Aidan. Can you all hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, good. Sometimes it goes a bit quiet. And thank you for publishing my poems. I'm delighted to be in Molly Bloom and to be here tonight. So I'm going to start off with the 3 poems that are in this issue. And I will be reading some poems from my pamphlet a bit later on. This is it. And I'll put my email in the chat just in case anybody's interested to contact me about it. So I'll get straight into it. And somebody's unmuted somewhere. We may have a cat invasion. There's a cat around. So I'll start off with
Rick Hall. You may be unmuted. If you could mute yourself, Rick, please.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hello.
Okay. So I'm going to start with a poem that I wrote last May, and it was the first time that I felt the courage to cross the Rubicon of my neighbourhood, and which is the Glastonbury bypass, which divides us, Glastonbury, from the Somerset levels. And on the levels, there are some wonderful RSPB reserves. And it's very peaceful, beautiful landscape to wander in, the wetlands and all the birds. We were chatting about birds earlier. But this felt particularly heightened, I guess. Today, the light, flecked with diamonds, how it dapples the green, then pools, slices through gaps, silhouetted by branch fretwork. It pirouettes, skips over willow leaves, the ecstasy of new summer unleashed without us. A fledgling hops up a branch, curious to taste sallow seeds, fluffy as itself. Blown catkins carpet the still dark of peaty water, crisscrossed by peepholes to a daze of blue, and a lake mazed with yellow lilies. Breeze tips corners of lily pads, reveals pale undersides like promises, scattered on leaves in song of chaffinch, Chetty's warbler, calling in life, newly fledged. I think one of the things that the times that I found hardest during lockdown was, it happened in the first lockdown and also this January, when the wind just howled the entire day. It really got to me. This wind rips through routines, flays skin, flings a watering can across the garden of my mind. Its clatter nags nerves, seeks the tiniest crack, throws up what's hidden, untethers grief, loosens my veneer, rattles the rawness in my chest, taunts my isolation, kills thinking with constant whine. Its tin drum bangs at my frustration, spins me into a cringing creature bleating mercy with paws over ears to stop it penetrating. I'm an animal that thrives in warmth, perhaps a stir of breeze in heat, not this howling. As Aidan mentioned, one of my passions is the environment and climate change, really, but relating to nature and our planet. And this one kind of resonates with that. When the crows disappeared. The first time I noticed the ash was no longer decked with cronky shapes, perched atop a tree like they do, or did, I said to myself, "Course, stone the..." The tree was silent. It always held several, squabbling over crusts, beaked from lawns. Now even fat gobby wood pigeons scorn the bread. Let it lie. When we realized the crows had gone, we knew without doubt we were maggots enthralled to shopping malls and shysters. We knew we must grow feathers, beaks, and shape up, or the eyes of the dead would never close. This next one is taken from Isabel Tree's account of rewilding Knepp House Farm in Sussex, which has kind of become a kind of role model and an inspiration to many others who are trying to rewild their land, including a huge area of New East Anglia, I think, is going to be rewilded. And it's based on Isabel Tree's account. It took 20 years. It was an utterly depleted dairy and arable farm. And then over the period of 20 years, it's now a safari destination and a wildlife, amazing place full of plants and birds and insects. It's fantastic, very inspiring. Rewilding the body. The ribs of my country jut, its dreams gutted, hopes tilled to exhaustion, fault lines exposed by monoculture expectation, by intensively farmed ambition. Let thistles stitch my wounds, as painted lady caterpillars feast on their prickles. Let pigs unzip my paths with cracks for bastard toadflax and meadowclary. Let ragwort flourish as 177 insect species thrive on its bad reputation. Let longhorn cattle tramp hoofprint pools for fairy shrimp, water crowfoot, stonewort. And one moonlit night, nightingales will return to fill my country with numinous song. One of the things I noticed at a reading I took part in last week is, I know poets and artists are very observant, but there's something about lockdown that's narrowed our focus into the tiny details around us. And I listened to several poems that were full of that last week, that mindfulness, you know, that we're forced to kind of close into our immediate surroundings. There's still somebody got a mic on somewhere. And this one has that. And it's called Dank. Everything you need to know in that one word about November, about the stare of sheep from a sodden field with yellowing grass that glitters, about the cronk of raven through fog, the dog straining its leash, the mud-brown coat of its owner, about luminous green of moss at the lane's centre, the sepia mash of mud and leaf plastering its edges, and beds of bleached sedge echoing with toot of coot, and chitter of wren as it flits into bramble, the arch of dead branch that dips into the ditch. So I'm going to read some from Girl Golem now, and this is this pamphlet, which is based, as Aidan said, on my Jewish migrant heritage. My parents were toddlers when they came to England from Russia back in 1912 and 1914. And it's also about my sense of being other, although I'm not going to read about it now, but you know, it was complicated for me because I wasn't just Jewish, but I wasn't straight either. So it just seemed like a double whammy. Anyway. And as Aidan has said, that the golem was like a man made of clay and Kabbalistic spells, apparently by the rabbis of Prague in the 17th century to protect the Jews from persecution. And I was a baby boomer. Girl Golem. The night they blew life into me, I clung bat-like to the womb wall. A girl golem, a late bonus before its final egg dropped. I divided, multiplied, my handbuds bloomed, tail vanished up its own coccyx, the lub-dub of my existence, bigger than my nascent head. I was made as a keep watch in case new nasties tried to take us away. The family called me Tchutchkala, our little Knedel, said I helped to make up for lost numbers, as if I could compensate for millions. With my X-ray eyes, I saw I was trapped in a home for the deaf and blind, watch them blunder into each other's craziness. My task, to hold up their world, be their assimilation ticket, find a nice boy and muzzle tov, grandchildren. But I was a hodgepodge golem, a schmotter garment that would never fit, trying to find answers without a handbook. When I turned 18, I walked away, went in search of my own kind, tore their God from my mouth. So just as a precursor to the next poem, certainly my parents' generation and even those of my generation, but it was dying out by then, a lot of them were in the rag trade. My dad was a tailor, my grandmother was a dressmaker. And there's a couple of references in here. There's something called a clomper, which was like a wooden block that tailors used to bash out creases when they were pressing clothes before the advent of wonderful steam irons. I remember my grandmother used to put water in her mouth and then just spray it over the cloth when she did the ironing. And I was surprised to learn that somebody didn't know what a horseshoe magnet was. They were big U-shaped magnets that tailors kept their pins on because, of course, you were dropping them all day. And at the end of the day, you go around with a magnet and you have all the pins back again. Anyway, this is called Three-Piece Suite. Mother, the rickety chair, teeters, needs a wedge to steady her, a chair from the old country, carried on backs, luggage racks, smuggled across borders. Father, a wooden ironing board, hides in the understairs cupboard, lost in the hiss of his steam iron, whistle of hearing aids, and bash of his clomper. Grandma, the puffy, leathery, round, smells of olives, lemon tea, and shit in shaky fingers, keeps teeth in her pocket. Between chair, ironing board and puffy, I, their horseshoe magnet, bristle with pins. So this poem, the only word I will try and explain is the word moil, and all I'm going to say is that it's a job description. Tradition. The moil wraps the tiny penis, gives a finger of wine for baby to suck. A dentist by trade, this is his special calling, removing foreskins with a V-shaped blade, deftly as prayers are uttered, tribal ritual witnessed. And God's strange need for all those bits of skin now satisfied. With new grandchild on his knee, father turns ashen. The women stand behind a curtain or in the kitchen, wait to catch falling men. One by one, they trail into the kitchen, sit head between legs, given sweet tea. Sorry about that, chaps. So, and, you know, interestingly, last week was Holocaust Memorial Day, so this is my contribution. Mine is not a Holocaust tale, rather one of those whose kin turned right instead of left. Only an aunt who worked for Coco Chanel ended in Auschwitz ovens, and great uncles liquidated by Stalin, which, age 7, I thought meant turned into soup. Others took boats to America, England, snipped their way through pogroms, tailored suits for the rich, waged war behind net curtains, changed names, learned to blend into suburban walls. Holocaust clings like a false reputation. My childhood spent practicing for next time, reading the entire war section in the library, learning to hide under floorboards, play resistance fighters. Holocaust is not my middle name, as if Lakota, bison gorillas and black lives don't count. Do Palestinians and tigers have no claim? Did Tatars not burn as fiercely when thrown into engine furnaces en route to Siberia? Does the flame of a yahrzeit candle discriminate as it sputters through a day, remembering? A yahrzeit candle is, it burns for 24 hours and it's lit on the anniversary of someone's death. So I've got the last 2 poems now, and this is in fact the last poem in the book, and it's a prose poem. Apocalypse Shoes. Whatever past life barefoot memory haunts her, she must have stout shoes for Armageddon. She bought buffalo hide shoes from California. They were her insurance. Come the collapse, she'd work the land. Greased with dubbin, her thick-skinned bodies should last a lifetime. Alas, they fell along the urban fashionista wayside in favour of Terry de Havilland, scarlet leather, tarty straps. Dystopian fears have returned to adorn her shoe rack. They'll house her feet, help her flee the neo-Nazi knock on the door. With yak tracks attached, she can escape on ice. She's enough pairs to see her through post-petroleum Arctic melt. When Hinkley Point collapses, she'll stride across the levels, sack of brine rice on her back, wind-up torch in her hand. And my last poem is also a prose poem, and it was written at a rather wonderful course in Bristol held by the Bristol laureate poet Caleb Parkin. And the title of the course was enough to draw me in. It was called Letting Down Your Avant-Garde. So I thought as a sort of homage to modernism, I'd read this. It's got a lot of portmanteau words in it. And it's called Edge Landing. Falling awake, I was stopping tracks, gobsmacked by physical, as if for the very first knuckle bump ever, smack bang against those eye, nose, ear, mouth sense gates, at beginning and at end, we wonderstruck by what is fingertip mouth immediate. And the light miracle in all its phases as night explodes into exuberant yes colours. What colour is grass to a baby with no word for green? In long ago, when there was no blue word, what was sky? What water? Wet, dry, rough, smooth. This bizarre assemblage of face. Whose face? What is this I, you, we, these holes in our face? Just taste it. And at the finale, we caught by spider flutter on window, brimful with slipper squirm under chair, by each tuft of carpet pile. Our prize? A fly-tip of stories compressed into the car crusher. All those revolutionisms, the same old retold. Nothing except this freeze frame. On the brink verge of extinction, instead of bitter dregs, skirt flank to thank yous. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. It was fantastic. Really, really good.
Thank you.
So many of my own interests and some of my background all welling through that. It always is in your work. So really good. So if Rachel draws inspiration, as she says, from nature, and I might add the ancient and numinous, maybe not the numinous, I don't know how you'd take that idea, Rachel, but it seems to me to be there. Anyway, much the same, I think, could be said of our second poet tonight, Francis Presley, although a very different writer. Francis' work engages closely with the landscape and with the nature and structure of the language in a rather more challenging and exciting way than fussing over fronted adverbials or whatever they are. Her many publications over more than 30 years include Lines of Sight, Holst for Hazel, and Ada Unseen on the mathematician and computer visionary Ada Lovelace, all of those published by Shearsman. She's also collaborated with graphic artists in An Alphabet for Alina with Peter John Skelt, published by 5 Seasons in 2012, and Sallow with Irma Isara, which came out from Leaf Press in 2016 and received an Arts Council award. The first part of her recent and I believe ongoing sequence, Black Fens Viral, will be published in Stephen Hitchens' literary pocketbook series. 3 short sections from it get the latest issue of Molly Bloom off to a powerful start, and I hope and believe you may be about to hear some of it now. Anyway, over to you, Frances.
Thank you. Thanks, Aidan. Yeah, I'm going to begin by reading from a sequence I was working on called Channels, which has to do with channels of water, estuaries particularly, and coastlines and also parallel coasts. And it, it has a mainly ecological theme, but it also, I started it in 2018, and it became a sort of reaction to Brexit as well. And the first one I'm going to read is set on the Bristol Channel, and it was part of a collaboration with Tiller Brading. This is on Boulder Beach. Always the eye is drawn to Barry Power Station, wherever we are on this coast. She draws a line to Llantwit. Suck and spew of the waves, gentle brown backwash in the heat. Robin scolds, is this summer or winter? White fishing boat midway, drawn across or pulled apart. That is the only real difference in all this difference. First there was a sea, then there was no sea, then there were trees, then there was no leaves or seeds. Sea worms hold the wood, repeat. I must learn to see, touch and hold at low tide when their world reaches ours. And I wrote that after going on an exploration of rock pools with the Somerset naturalist Nigel Phillips. And one of the things he showed us was a sea anemone, which brought back a particular memory. So this is sea anemone. In the rock pool, small red sea anemone, beadlet. After 50 years, it grows as big as a tennis ball, eats dead crab meat very slowly. Ted Hughes said, England is a sea anemone, which swallows us whole. His hand opened and closed. Sea an enemy. I said, it's a choice, isn't it? He was red, would swallow me whole. Another place I've grown to love, another estuary, is the Solway Firth, which is on the west side between England and Scotland. And this was written on the Scottish side. It's called Needle's Eye. It's about a very spectacular rock formation, of which there are several along the sort of Dumfries and Galloway coast. And it's an archway. And if you can imagine that, even though it's on the Scottish side, that one part is English and the other is Scottish, it'll make more sense. Needle's Eye. Line of salmon fishing stakes at right angles, abandoned, no half netting across the Solway. Needle's Eye arches over. Incisions in the greywacke, leaf motif, Inca divisions, lost maps, relish device, tender sandstone, rummaged ears, licorice white spill, quartz waterfall. Telltale totem, tweaked impanum, titular trouble, twiddles his thumbs, behind a tailor dummy in tubular suit. Hunched collar overshadows head lower than testicular shrinkage. Storm through the arch, up from the south. Come on, lass, good girl. Scottish deerhound, she says. Words lost, I touch her bony skull. 2. I rise high, fold on fold, anticlinal, igneous. I rise high, pink strata. This one is actually from the Thames estuary, and it was written in response to a time-lapse video by my friend and collaborator, the artist Maria Sara, and she gathered material from the Thames and then examined it under a microscope. Play with sunlight, lean on green glass, weathered by the Thames. Blue light, dark Matterhorn, ice melts, blue crystal, pulled apart, hunched over. Blue's loss, white floss, tardigrade too. Jewels of sand, microfiber, transported by the tide. Blue oak, fossilized wood, freezing under film. Baby wipes, time lapses, round diatom. Ghost of a shrimp, legged thing, fondment, counts our red eggs. And the last one I'm going to read in this sequence is it's called Scalt Head, which is a tiny island just off the north coast of Norfolk. And I should explain that the second part is taken from an essay by the naturalist and photographer E.L. Turner, Emma Louise Turner, who was also the first watcher on Scalt Head in the 1920s when it was protected. This essay of hers about birds was published in a book called Scalt Head Island in 1932, which also looks at the possible derivation of the name Scalt, which appears in different forms on different historic maps. Scalt Head, and this was written in March 22, so just before lockdown. Held firm by marram grass on Gun Hill, perch of protective fir. Footprints up the dune. Why climb a bunker? Why dig yourself deeper? Beyond the channel, Scalt Head Island, low and flat, rises high enough to be sculled. The truth is, and the truth is, lapwing throats. What of my throat? Not right today, gurgles back. Wild privet and a sweet cheep takes off, alone, bouncing on the air above the dunes. Marram strand pierces my palm into a lifeline. Someone had to prove they could climb, bare feet, breaking up, breaking away, push back. 2. She placed the body of a tern upon a hill. All at once, shadows on the grass, hovering terns, swoop down in 2s and 3s until they almost touch the corpse. Rise again. Face me in perfect silence, poised above my head. 200 pairs of dark eyes, because you have done this thing, this murder. 3. Slight incline of scalp, slight rising up before the sea, slight taking in and gathering up. No regular mould, no holding mould, self-moulding, self-isolate. So that was March 2020, and then I got COVID. And 2 months or so later, I was feeling a bit better. I was starting to recover. And also lockdown was easing. And I was able to go and visit my friends in Norfolk. Hello, Anthony, wherever you are. And I went on this slow train that goes through the Black Fens. And I never paid a lot of attention to the Black Fens before, but I'd come across this little book, An Introduction to the Black Fens. So I began to make these notes on the train. And at the same time, I was talking to Steve Hitchens about something called the Markov chain text generator, which is algorithm, which is used for things like predictive spelling. And I put these notes, which seemed to me just like notes, through, rather than finished poems, through this algorithm. And the results that came out I found quite interesting. They were kind of scrambled, a bit like my brain after COVID, and somehow in that way appropriate. There's quite a lot of repetition, which makes it almost like a litany at times. It also means that if I lose my place, you probably won't realise. So this is the one I wrote in June, which is going to appear from Steve Hitchens Press. I'll show you that at the end. 1. Standing water in meres, maintain our embankment, swaying water in meres on hard stands, swaying slightly on our scarp, combed green rose in the shape of a black lozenge. Grey sky and rain to mark my dark massed escape. Loco Espresso is closed. Thank you for your cooperation. Operation Combed Green Rose, in my throat the shape of a black fen rasps in the black lozenge grey sky and rain. Our scarp combed to mark my dark massed escape. Standing water in my throat the shape of a black fen, rasp in meres combed green rose in the black fens, rasp in my throat the black earth. Thank you for your embankment. Combed green rose in the black fens, rasp in my dark massed escape. Loco Espresso is closed. Maintain our scarp. The black fens rasp in meres on our scarp. Combed grey sky and rain to mark massed escape. Loco Espresso is closed. Thank you for your scarp. Combed green rose in the black lozenge, rasp in my throat, the shape of a black ear. 2. In my throatons, rasp in my throat, the black fens rasp in my throat, asp in my oats, rasp in my throat, attack fens rasp in my throat, throat fens rasp in my throat, black, fens rasp in my throat, fens rasp in my throat, lack, fens rasp in my throat, rasp in my throat, in my throat root, in my throat app, in my throat spur, in my throaty fens, rasp in my throat, black fens. 3. Black lozenge, lozen, geozen, lozen, ge, lozen, lozen, gek, lozen, ge, lack, gozen, lozen, gain, lozenge, lozenge, black. And this is August. Breathe it in through every night, black earth and a poor harvest, too wet, too dry, these perfect furrows beyond the freight. I'm soaked through. Take it in through your body. Does it feel like the machinery is soaked? Given these perfect lines of combed willows across my face, across my cheekbones of combine, does it feel like every night the machinery is black combed willows? Beyond surface, down into black earth, breathe it in through your body. Talk through these seagulls on a black striped shirt. Given the blonde earth cannot be read, given these perfect lines of combine stretch across my face. Back combed stubble, let it talk through the remnant harvest. I am soaked through every night. It is seagulls on a black striped, stubble blonde surface, bear down into black earth and a poor halve. It is soaked through the red beyond the freight, carve my dark path back. Combed stubble blonde surface, bear down into striped shirt willows beyond the black earth. Breathe the remnant harvest, too wet, too dry. The machinery is soaked through your body. Take it down. Let it talk through every night. And this is October. Things are getting a bit easier by then, so there's a bit more distraction going on. 1. What I'm desperate to do before another lockdown, Littleport. I've never felt better than long COVID. I'm not desperate to do Thrasher Skateboard magazine. I'm sitting on the train, scratches his shoulder, I haven't eaten. I'm sitting on the reeds. Pastor evangelists of energy. Thanks to long COVID, I can do very little. I'm not desperate to do. Littleport. What I am stopped from doing on the train. Pastor evangelists. You can't keep yelling like this. Before he died, the carriages migrating, flocks, majorettes, field square, her irregular metronome clock down, migrating on the square brow stubble field, rushes, fearsome bang between the carriages, migrating flockwork, migrating flock down, Littleport. I'm sitting on the train, these 8-hour bursts of energy, what I'm not desperate to do before another lockdown, what I'm desperate to do. 2. And this is an overheard monologue, scrambled. He said, how can I have 3 daughters who are raging lesbians and feminists? I just want equality. What's wrong with that? I mean, these are children, and they voted against giving free meals to children, and they're starving. How can you think like that? We should normalise people getting an education and changing their minds. They're starving their minds. They voted against giving free meals to children and changing their minds. They voted against giving an education. How can you think like that? He said, how can I have 3 daughters who are raging in education? And they're starving. How can you think like that? What's wrong with an education? How can I have 3 daughters who are children and feminists? And they voted against giving 3 daughters who are raging lesbians. I just want equality. What's wrong with people getting free meals to children? And they're starving lesbians in their minds. They're starving. How can you think like that? He said, these are children. I mean, these are raging. He said, how can I have 3 daughters who are raging lesbians and feminists? I just want equality. What's wrong with that? He said, how can you? Three. Everything was orange, Magdalene. Inflated lanterns. Everything was harvest festival. You found a giant quince. We have turned a space. Orange calyces in the black fens. We have turned in your runnels. We are watching the sky ploughed to the towers. We have punctuated your telegraph wires. We have turned in the pipit souped. We are watching the sky ploughed by the pipits, ucht by the black fens. We have turned in your telegraph wires. Ploughed by the pipit sends. We have punctuated your runnels, unploughed to the towers. We are watching the pipits, ploughed by the sky. We have punctuated lanterns, Magdalene. Pipits sing large in the church, unploughed by the Pipits Festival. And this is the last one, which is November. She said her name was in November rain. You'll find it's tier 3. Lines that go on forever through a wintergreen field, or furrows filled with water, never fallow. Soil is compacted. I think of you, oh fallow. For a year she kissed you, said her name was to live among these exhausted fields. How lonely it was to live among these permanently harvested fields. Are those roosts or the last leaves? Lying low for a year, she said her name was fallow. I think of you. Low for a year, she kissed you. I'm just getting to the trees, beautiful shutters of Brandon. I'm not getting off, I'm just getting low. If you're lucky, a copse or a corpse of a field. Lying low for a year, she kissed you. The hedges grubbed out. There are those roosts or these exhausted fields. There are no grubs. Beautiful shutters of Brandon. I'm not getting off, I'm getting nearer my bike. The last leaves clinging to the soil, compacted, never fallow. lying low forever through a wintergreen field or furrows filled with water. All the hedges grubbed out. There are you, leaves clinging nearer my bike. Oh, fallow, for a year she kissed you, getting off. I'm just getting to the trees, beautiful shutters of Brandon. If you're lucky, a copse. If you said her name was to live among these exhausted fields. If she kissed you, leave tier 2. Lying low for a year, she kissed you. For a year, she kissed you. And I just wanted to show you, thank you. I just wanted to show you, this is the thing that Stephen Hitchens is publishing from the first. It's a bit like an origami puzzle, or one of those games you played when you were at school. It sort of opens out, so it's sort of like flat but opens out. So you can get that from Stephen Hitchens Press. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francis. I love that Black Friends viral stuff. I think the way the external and the internal kind of intermesh, I think, is great. And the man with the 3 daughters on the train out. But,
yeah, that was a gift.
Yeah, beautifully done. Beautifully done. So finally tonight we'll hear from Janet Sutherland, who I might describe as a well-established Molly Bloom poet, having appeared in its pages 5 times, which is as often as anyone has. Widely anthologized, from the Virago Book of Love Poetry to the Paladin New British Poetry 1968 to 88, which is where I, and no doubt a lot of other people, first came across her work. She received a Hawthornden Fellowship in 2018. A very varied writer, promoter of poetry and a mentor of poets. Janet is the author of 4 collections published by Shearsman from 2006 to 2019, Burning the Heartwood, Hangman's Acre, Bone Monkey, and the most recent, Home Farm, which appeared exactly 2 years ago and remains one of my favourite books of recent years. So here is Janet. I hope. Are you there,
Yeah,
Janet?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Excellent.
Good.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to read the first half from my last collection, which is Home Farm. That's this with the cow on the front. And then the second half is going to be new poems from a sequence that I'm working on called The Messenger House. So Home Farm is a collection about growing up on a farm. It's about memory and about landscape and about looking at the earth itself as a home farm and how we look after it. We were the tenants of a 90-acre farm, 50 Frisian cows, and about 20 calves and heifers. And the heifers spent their summers on water meadows where the Hampshire Avon runs. The water meadows were separated from the farm. So when we were kids, my sister and I would be sent to count them. And we'd walk to the water meadows, past the old watermill and its eel house. The eel house was partly made of wood, and you could look into it through a knot hole in one of the boards. So this is called the eel house. The eel house. Put your eye to the knot hole in the feather edge board of the small house just to the bridge. Pinhole slits and gaps let in the boarding and the brick, suffocated grey. The floors a sloping grid for eels to fall on when the weir's in flood. At night, white water grinds over and over through this sieve. And in that loneliness, the eels come quietly one by one, driven by longing for a spawning place at sea. Slither an eye across the peep show floor. The risen dark pools where eels still hide, trapped in a storage well, somersaulting, tumbling and unbalancing. Their tender fins caress each other, water, air, slip off a little luminosity. We'd fetched the cows in for milking, and one of our fields was called Stony Ground. And I've got a memory of fetching them in one morning when only their heads were visible above the fog. So this is cows in fog. Cows in fog. The cows are lying under fog in stony ground. Their disembodied heads turn as I come to fetch them in. They chew the cud and shift, beginning the articulations of joint and sinew, heft of hind legs, knees. Fastened to the earth and to the dawn through which this fog has settled, they breathe out gusts of steam. Above the fog, the hazels at the edge are floating verticals. How can I take this herd home? And this is a piece about the farmhouse. Metal window left ajar for air. Extraordinary light is coming in across the farm. Look how few things there are for it to settle on. This chair, this chest of drawers, this wardrobe and this sampler. There is a modest diffidence about the bed, but the light denies it. The pillows bruised by absences. And the next poem is, it's a longer piece called Gifts for Lethe. It's made up of a series of 3-line stanzas, and each is a separate little memory. And in between the memories is a line or two about the stretch of water it's near or the water source nearby. And it starts when I was 5, and it works through memories chronologically. So really, in a book about memory, it's the poem about what is forgotten. There are a couple of references that you might need to know about. My grandfather was a medical officer in the First World War in charge of water supplies in Mesopotamia. And when I was in my teens, he told me a story about that. And there's a 3-line extract from my great-great-grandfather's journal about traveling to Serbia in October 1847. So this is Gifts for Lethe. The water bailiff thought I was a boy, the water bailiff who was bitten by a grass snake beside the Avon by the water meadows. My mother slipped us past wild daffodils to a gate marked private, where I said to her, this means we should stop, but we went on. The deer pond in the field we called Horatio was so overgrown with weeds, a child could run across it. My skin was a nasturtium leaf, my stomach hollow underwater, the bathroom bitter cold and Lido blue, above the Avon in the farmhouse bath. A film about Helen Keller, her first word dropped on the back of her hand, water gushing from a cast iron pump. In Salisbury, Avon, Nada, Ebble, Wiley, Bourne, the sweating weir-gates holding back a flood. And the standing pool he used in Mesopotamia, he was captain RAMC to General Marshall's headquarters, seemed good to drink till the dead Turk resurfaced between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. After milking, I scraped, then hosed the parlour, the usual order, entrances, stands, corridors, yard. High pressure drove the shit in pretty deviations. A coiled pressure hose kept where, I have forgotten, somewhere above the Avon, above the water meadows. Her granny said to me, Thalassa, meaning go to the sea and swim. I walked to the monastery. I was alone. Here the Fahinus River ran, at Poros, a natural crossing. I lay detached that first night in the bedset on an old iron bedstead. Oiled cloud in spate outstripped the window. at Springfield, where they found a Saxon boat. Those nights we lay together, foreheads tightly pressed, all night awake, and then all day awake, our bodies languid, of South Millfields, Lammaslands, and Hackney Marshes. His first word was, "A day, a day, a day." The gist of it, "My God, that train is beautiful." We watched it with him, pulled the buggy backwards. The railway arch, the timber yards, the lost meanders. When you arrived at your mother's house, a mad apple woman had barred the door of the house which was long since demolished, but the river Lethe, which flows underneath the town. We skirted the reservoir, having been dropped off by a Mallorcan taxi driver, a slight climb to the ridge, then zigzag paths through olive groves, the Cuba Reservoir, and then the torrent of Binarix. It was morning, so we washed her, flannel, soap, warm water, skirting that dimple in her lower back, her last breath as we turned her. Alderbury, which has no river running by it. "You'll be the death of me," he cried out to the doctor when he was dying and his shit was black and foul. To us he hissed, "Don't be so bloody silly." Alderbury and the goldfish pond we dug together. At the empty crossroads, a very small grass snake lifted its head, poured itself across tarmac towards water, making for Pellbrook Cut and River Ouse. A three-line stave hung between telephone poles on either side of the river. Late August swallows, a gathered song. Hard by the Ouse, the water meadows. I ordered my horse for a short ride, indescribably filthy, slippery and cold. I was glad to have seen Alexnitsa in its winter garb, perhaps for the last time. Below, a broad plain through which the Morava serpentined. A grass snake writhed and thrashed around the beak of a heron who was hunting by the river Lethe and the goddess Lethe, water both nameless and invisible. Daubenton's bat was skimming the river, the serotine at tree height aping birds. Bat conservers aimed their lights. All of us listened to their calls. The blue enameled throat, the water snake, at Wiley's footbridge, where we stopped to stare. So the next set of poems I'm going to read are from the sequence that I'm working on at the moment, which is called The Messenger House, about my great-great-grandfather's trip to Serbia. He went in 1846 and in 1847. His name was George Davies, and he travelled with a Mr. Gutch, who was a Queen's messenger. And he left two journals, which are held in my family, and I've got one of them here, so I'm just going to show you. So that is his picture of the Messenger House. And it says at the top, Messenger House, Alexnitsa, 2nd of November, 1847. And then there's also another picture here, which is called Risto's New House, Alexnitsa, 2nd of November, 1847, built expressly for Queen's messengers. Okay, so and the rest of it is his journal, sort of day by day, 2 months of the trip. And there's another book, another journal just like this, about him traveling with Mr. Gutch. So Queen's messengers were men employed by the government to take dispatches to all parts of the world where the government had an interest. And the journey started at Downing Street and travelled by was by carriage and horses, by train, by steamer, by post horse on the wilder bits of Hungary and Serbia, where there often weren't any roads at all at the time. And they travelled to this place called, it's now called Alexinek, and then it was called Alexnitsa. And they travelled there because it was near to the border of the Ottoman Empire at that time. They stayed in the messenger house while waiting for dispatches from Constantinople in the Ottoman Empire. Many of the journeys in Serbia and Hungary were done on horseback. And roads could just be places in the forest where trees had just been cut down. So this is called On Horseback in All Weathers. Sometimes in winter, when snow lies 2 yards deep in a country without roads, wolves, pressed with hunger, circle the sheepfolds. Sometimes the rider, tested to the limit of patience, must frequently alight to open clumsy gates and their clumsier fastenings. Or a canopy of foliage impervious to light harbours loneliness. Only the creaking of the saddle allays desolation. Deep forest abounds with immense tracts of oak, wild plums and cherries, then pieces of ground just brought into use. 5 or 6 feet of each tree stands up straight, partially burnt, brigades of lost soldiers quartered in cornfields. While they were in Alexnitsa, Mr. Gutch and great-great-grandfather met a travel writer called Edmund Spencer. He'd just come out of quarantine as he'd inadvertently strayed into Bosnia from Serbia through wooded mountains. And he was caught by a troop of soldiers. Quarantine in the 1840s, when the disease they were avoiding was the plague, sounds a lot more fun than the hotel room that you get these days. So this is called quarantine. I was quartered with a wild and motley crew, Turks and Arnauts, Greeks and Zinzars, Jews, Armenians and Gypsies, all habited in the costume of their tribe and speaking tongues as might have rivaled Babel. Our 4-footed companions were doomed to quarantine with us and made their own concert, braying, lowing and barking. Of all the wayfarers' annoyances, quarantine's most prejudicial to health. The quarantine establishment is large, strong palisades and a guard of pandas, sheds for merchandise, stables, a han, and huts for wealthier travellers. But most were Kirigi, swineherds and drovers who preferred the night air to the expenses of a han and who bivouacked in a large space in the centre around a blazing fire. I saw 300 to 400 persons drink gallon after gallon of wine and raki. But here was no quarrelling nor fighting. They sang, smoked, danced and cooked, performed on the bagpipe, reed and guzla, and hearkened to storytellers and bards who asked but just a few pari from their listeners. Our clothes, bedding and papers were fumigated, although there's been no case of plague for several years. Every little item swells the traveller's bill of costs, the guard of honour demanding a bakshish. So part of the work that I've been doing on this project is writing my own journals of my travels on the same route, and writing some poems around what I found. I went to the Ethnographic Museum in Belgrade in Serbia, where there was a display of walking sticks. The description of the walking sticks contained an error and said that walking sticks were staked to a man's grove. So I wrote 3 pieces called Grave, Grove and Grieve. One of the walking sticks was covered with snakeskin. So these 3 little poems start with an extract from the journal. So I'll read the extract first. Mahadia, Saturday the 16th of May, 1846. Bathed. Went after breakfast a delightful walk along a beautiful path up the bank of the river. Stupendous crags appearing at every break in the dense foliage, 500 or 600 feet from the brink of the river, whose waters laved its base. Saw several snakes, some 1.5 yards long, all venomous here, black spotted with blue, fawn and black, black and white. So that's written by great-great-grandfather George Davies. Grave. The first's a squared-off shepherd's crook with a rounded hook, uncarved, utilitarian. The shepherds used their sticks as hooks. A muscled wolf dives over the top of the second, a symbol of status for a comet, a Canaz, and an Obercanaz, with a goose between its blade front paws, snarling, snarling. His tail flies down the shaft, groves under groves, where other wolves, a bridled horse and helmeted rider, an eagle grasping a dove in its talons, trees, leaves and flowers, all live extraordinary lives in the untamed forest. The third is a feminine clenched fist in a very dark wood, the old, the infirm, the heart of its rage, hardened in darkness. The fourth is tightly covered from head to foot in a snakeskin, because a stick that touches a snake that has caught a bird carries magical powers, and the knowledge of wild language is never given by the bird, but always by the serpent. Scales on the curved handle are softened and worn. Regular, faint markings pattern this staff, which seems to be always on the brink of a wild translation. Grove. At the Ethnographic Museum in Belgrade is a small display of walking sticks, above which is written a note in English, which explains they'd be staked to a man's grove. A misunderstanding, it turns out, as it should say grave, not grove. But in the meantime, we've already decorated the place with vines, an orchard, goats, and an outdoor table where the man's family are having supper, fish, bread, wine, and a good plum brandy. In the background, the walking stick casts a thin shadow, staked to its grove, rooted in evening light, implacable, ready. Grieve. Grieve for the beautiful path, for the breath of wind in the branches, for the dense foliage, for the coiled and uncoiled, for the curled word, for the laving of water, for the laying out of time, for the knowing of a wild language. And lastly, I'm going to read a poem called In Alex Nitsa, Captain Spencer's account. Any instructions to the people there at that time were given out by way of a town crier. And of course there was no gas or electricity for lighting. In Alex Nitsa, Captain Spencer's account. A drummer is sent forth to announce new laws or to call the people to arms. He also announces rat-a-tat-tat, the exact hour of nightfall. Then gaudily painted transparent paper lanterns, folded so they fit in a pocket, are brought out and lit, there being no street lamps. To walk without a lantern is a punishable offence. They float in all directions, small, obedient glowworms in the vastness of the night.
Thank you, Janet. I was that was lovely. I was just thinking there right at the end that To Walk Without a Lantern sounds like a great title for someone should do something like that. Anyway, so that's it, folks. I hope you've enjoyed hearing from all three of tonight's poets as much as I have. Thank you for coming, tuning in, or however you think of this kind of virtual gathering. And especially thanks to Rachael Clyne, Francis Presley and Janet Sutherland for their inspiring readings, which I think somehow blended together beautifully. I hope you agree. Do seek out their work in print if you haven't already done so. Likewise, check out their contributions to Molly Bloom and see what other goodies are to be found there. Finally, let me just give you advance notice of the next Molly Zoom reading, which will be on Monday, March the 8th, and feature Rick Hoole, Claire Crowther and Peter Robinson. I hope to see you all again then. For now, however, good night and stay safe. Thank you all.